Hi, this is O'Connor. Welcome back. And I want to give you an update on the latest goings on with regard to companies' ESG reporting, specifically their Scope 3 emissions reporting. And this is important because in the last 18 months, various stock exchanges and regulatory bodies around the world have agreed to mandate company reporting on Scope 3 emissions, not just Scope 1 and Scope 2, especially across the stock exchanges in Asia. The SEC is doing that now, and also in Europe. So by time 2024, 2025, 2026, depending on the size of the company in different industries, there will be a mandated reporting of Scope 3. So what I want to do is report on a survey of 338 companies across 6 bourses in the region, stock exchanges, and in terms of what their current situation is with regard to their ESG standard setting, their strategies, their organisational-wide toolkit for managing their ESG climate risks, their approaches to emissions measurement, and how are they talking to the supply chain. So I'll look at these 4 areas in turn in this presentation. But before we start, I just want to show you that I spent a year in working with my team, selecting and filtering companies to be included in this report. And we got 338 companies across these 6 stock exchanges, and all of them had to have had an ESG report. So we didn't choose a company that didn't have an ESG report. And so we've got 100% of our sample that have an ESG report, but not 100% of the sample with regard to their Scope 3 emission strategy, their emissions targets, anything to do with their emissions measurement side of their ESG reporting. And that's what this study has been about. As you can see, most of the companies are represented in Australia, Japan, and South Korea, a smaller percentage, Hong Kong, China, and Singapore. And a broad cross-section of companies have been represented. We looked at annual reports of 2022 and 2023 where possible. Remember, we started this at the beginning of 2023 before companies had finalised and published their 2023 reports. Stage 2, the data extraction template, we had 36 items of data collected, ranging from the carbon emissions data disclosed, the climate scenario analysis, and governance, as well as assurance, downstream emissions reporting, as well as upstream emissions reporting. And in total, we had 36 different data items. And then what we did was manually coded each of those items into ones and zeros that enabled us to create percentages or extent of reporting in these 36 different areas. So what I'm going to do now is take you through the results of this analysis, starting with setting the ESG standards strategy, then the organisational-wide toolkit, approaches to emissions measurement, and talking to the supply chain. As you can see, most of the companies in Asia Pacific mention Scope 3 in the ESG reporting. We're talking 62%. The minerals and mining sector leads in terms of Scope 3 emissions. South Korean firms tended to prioritise external assurance more than firms elsewhere. What about this net zero targets versus carbon emissions targets? Net zero is from the GHG Paris Agreement. We're talking about 5-6 different types of gases that need to be reported on, whereas carbon emissions is just one of those gases under net zero. So commitments to net zero targets by 2050, on average, 51% of companies were making commitments to the net zero targets. But 68% were making commitments to carbon neutrality, which is one element of the net zero targets. And then we had 74% down to 12%, ranging from those different stock exchanges, those companies, percentage of companies making commitments to intermediate targets. And what is important about the intermediate targets is it's more likely that that is a much harder commitment to make. It's easy as a CEO to make a commitment in 25 years' time, in 2050. It's much more difficult to make a commitment for 5 years' time in 2030 or 10 years' time in 2035, when you're more likely to be around if you're interested in staying on long term with that company. All right. So obviously commitment to immediate targets are much more critical than commitment to the 2050 targets. Okay, what about risk assessment and materiality statements? Most of the companies are undertaking climate risk assessments, 83%, whereas only 44% are reporting their materiality assessment. And what we mean by that is they're actually going through and having a rubric where they determine what is material to their strategy and what is the relevance of each of these material items to various stakeholders, whether it's investors, creditors, the bankers, upstream, downstream, suppliers, etc. Okay, then the next question we asked was, okay, you have this materiality statement and you have this risk statement that you're making. To what extent are you combining or incorporating carbon emissions into, or GHG emissions into this materiality statement? And that's more important than just having a material statement to begin with. And only 30% on average companies are including carbon and GHG emissions in their materiality assessments. All right, what about assurance? That's another thing. You have to pay for assurance. So it's really nice to note that 62% of companies are getting external assurance, led by South Korea, Australia, and Japan. Now we want to move to the next stage, and that is the organization-wide toolkit. And that is the toolkit for enabling a company to tackle its Scope 3 emissions to meet their GHG targets or their carbon emissions targets. First of all, the organizational structure and design. Different ESG practices are undertaken by Asia-Pacific companies, right? 62% have an ESG sustainability committee. Interesting, that compares to 89% of Fortune 100 companies reported by Fortune.com. 17% have executive KPIs with a scorecard, 16% climate-related task force, and 9% executive incentives and remuneration. If we look at their executive incentives, as you can see, Japan and South Korea are leading in the use of KPIs, whereas Australia is leading in terms of linking the KPIs to executive incentives. Next, partnerships is another element of the toolkit, and you'll see that 40% of companies are engaging with NGOs, 36% industry associations, much less with external consultants, government entities, and universities. What about sustainable product design? Noticing that 51% of companies are investing in product design and innovation. 44% are investing in sustainable packaging. Remember, if we want to get away from greenwashing, we need to see investments in product design and innovation, because it's the innovation and marketing are the two value creation areas of all organizations. If we look at investment in green initiatives, 30% of companies are investing in green initiatives. Now, let's go to the next stage of approaches to measuring Scope 3 emissions. And this is the most tricky area. If we look at the downstream emissions disclosures, you can see on average, the average is actually less than 20%, with the most occurrence of disclosures being around the use of sold products, downstream transportation and distribution, and end-of-life treatment of sold products. If you look at upstream Scope 3 emissions disclosures, you can see that a greater percentage of companies are engaging with disclosing the emissions of product, goods and services, business travel, upstream transportation and distribution, fuel and energy-related activities. If we look at Scope 3 emissions measurement approaches, we can start with an accounting type-based measurement strategy of a spend-based method. We can go into more detail with an activity-based method, and then a hybrid, which could be a mixture of activity-based and supplier-based, or we can have a supplier-specific method, and then finally a life cycle assessment, which is actually cradle to grave method of measuring the carbon emissions of each of the products. And so an example of the extent to which these different methods are deployed by the companies, as you can see, on average, 26% have a product-specific LCA, and of that, 7.3% of companies have a product-specific and a partnership-based. And so I'd like to think in terms of those that have a materiality assessment and carbon emissions, they're more likely to have an LCA approach to measuring their emissions compared to those that don't have a materiality risk assessment in place. And so an example here is Breville, where they're partnering with University of New South Wales Engineering Division to do a cradle-to-grave LCA analysis of their coffee-making machine products. Now, finally, I want to report on what companies are disclosing in terms of how they are working with their supply chain. First of all, 24% of companies are engaging with their consumers in downstream supply chain. 7% are undertaking research questionnaires. 11% are engaging on both methods. 58% are not even engaging with the consumers or doing research at all. In contrast, if we look at upstream supply chain management strategies, you can see that over 66% are engaging in terms of environmental and social requirements of supplier onboarding process. 63% are undertaking supplier assessment and audits. 57% are undertaking supplier training and engagement programs. 26% give priority to supplier certification and environmental action targets. And as you can see, Japan and South Korea are leading in many of these different engagements. So we want to talk to the supply chain in these areas. Now, getting back and looking at a green heat map of all of these 36 different areas, you can see that most of the green is occurring around the climate-related risk assessment and materiality assessments. There's some green pockets, definitely in Australia, South Korea, and Japan, in the area of carbon and GHG emissions identified and Scope 3 emissions disclosure data. But when we go down to downstream and upstream and supplier measurement, you can see that there's much less engagement when it comes to how we are measuring the emissions. And that's very important to distinguish companies that are just disclosing emissions and greenwashing type approaches and those that are disclosing their emissions and also talking about how they are measuring their disclosure of emissions. So what is the key takeaway for companies and for you, the audience, of this reporting assignment? That is, engage the C-suite and board, measure emissions, invest more in getting finer measurement of emissions, model supply chain risk, find low carbon opportunities, work with suppliers. Very, very important, because you just cannot just go into the supplier and say, we want to measure everything about your activities so we can move from spend-based to a supplier-based measurement strategy. You need to have a good relationship and explore potential partnerships. Just like Breville is doing, they're partnering with University of New South Wales to do a cradle to grave life cycle analysis of their coffee machines. And also, in some ways, the key takeaway is we're moving from sustainability disclosures, which is kind of more like a greenwashing approach to appease shareholders, to thinking about how better measurement can lead and drive strategy and drive value for the organisation. We can talk about the key takeaways of various countries where Japan and South Korea are tending to lead with their strong focus on resource efficiency and establish supplier relationships, whereas India and China are driven more by government regulations and investor pressure. However, challenges to data transparency and supply chain complexity remain. Southeast Asia are in the early stages. Countries like Vietnam and Thailand are witnessing growing awareness of the importance of ESG in supplier relationship management due to global market pressures and trade agreements. So that really serves the end of the reporting of this project. And the big takeaway I want you to think about is that the core to improving emissions disclosure is in the measurement, but the core to driving that measurement to strategic value of the firm lies in the firm's strategy. And how do we understand the strategy more? By looking at their materiality matrix and whether they're incorporating carbon or GHG emissions into the materiality matrix of the firm's strategy. Then you know that firm is well positioned and they know that they're going to invest in the areas of measurement, working with the suppliers with better relationships so they can get better emissions measurement and better value-added outcomes in years to come. This is O'Connor. Thank you for listening to this report, and catch you through email or in the discussion group. Bye for now.